Well, everyone's quiet, so that's probably a signal for me. I'm Robert Klein. I'm Vice Chancellor for Academic and Student Affairs. The job kind of expanded July 1st, so my title's changed. And so just a short, very funny story. So I've only been here 42 years, and my phone number's been the same for 42 years. I allowed my new business cards to be printed with the wrong phone number and actually filled it in myself. So it's just a sign of age, I guess. Well, good afternoon. Thank you all for coming to the first Campus-Wide Leadership Series presentation of 2018. A welcome to all of our colleagues who are watching online via live stream. And we really have an outstanding series. Jenny Mehmet is a person in charge of the series now, and she has put together a bow? Yes, okay. Has really put together a spectacular series. It's funded jointly by the Office of Academic and Student Affairs and the KU Health System. And you can check flyers at the back table, see the complete schedule, or of course you can go online at kumc.edu/CWLS, Campus-Wide Leadership Series, if you want to check on future events. Today I'm pleased to introduce our distinguished speaker, Dr. Alicia Clair. She's a professor emeritus of music education and music therapy at the University of Kansas. She's an internationally renowned musical therapist. She's well known for her clinical practice and research, and she has some areas of specialty. She's worked with persons with dementia and their families, persons in rehab for chronic COPD, rehab for persons with movement disorders due to injury or disease. She's a very well-respected educator. In her 38-year teaching career at the University of Kansas, Dr. Clair was the recipient of several awards and honors, including the University of Kansas Chancellor's Award for Teaching Excellence, and she has been honored with the American Association for Music Therapy Presidential Award for Service on the Commission for Education and Training. She has held several leadership positions throughout her career, including chair of the Music Education and Music Therapy Department at KU, interim dean of the School of Music at KU, president of the American Music Therapy Association. We are honored to have Dr. Clair here today. Her talk is Emerging Leadership Challenges. If not you, then who? I have one business piece. That is in the question and answer time. If you would wait till a microphone arrives so the live streaming folks can hear the questions and the subsequent answer. Would you please join me in welcoming Dr. Clair to the podium? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And it's really nice that you get to eat while you're here. Lots of times that doesn't happen. So I'm glad to see that you're comfortable, but it is a little distracting to me. Okay, I'm going to ask the tech people, is the microphone okay? They made me take my necklace off. So that was disturbing. It's all right. I'll put it on later. Anyway, it's a delight to be here with you, and I'm amazed that there are so many here who might be interested in music therapy or not. And I told Jenny that we needed to do a little music because you would really expect that, right? And so this is a song I chose that I hope a lot of you know. Do you know this song? And working in dementia, I always could count on people knowing songs because they experienced them in music education when they were children. But now a lot of music educators don't teach these kinds of songs, and so I can't always count on it with younger audiences, and you are much younger audiences. And this is going to take you away from your eating for a moment, if you will be willing to indulge. What I'd like for us to do is to work together with a little bit of what I will call attention control training. And it will involve some clapping and some singing, and if you don't sing, my experience with medical people, they don't sing. So, if you would just chant the words, that would be perfect. All right. So I'm going to try to do this without really telling you anything, because this is something that I did with people who had late-stage dementia. I'll just let you know that right now. So we're going to provide some of our own accompaniment, and I'm going to just quit talking. So I'm going to give you signals, and we're hoping this is going to work. All right, so. Not singing yet. I love it that you're so eager to sing, but just hold your horses a moment. And let's slow this down just a little bit. Okay, there we go. Okay? Good. And slow. Just a little bit. Okay. All right. Oh, I come from Alabama with my banjo on my knee. I'm going to Louisiana, my true love for to see. Rained all night the day I left, the weather it was dry. The sun so hot I froze to death. Susanna, don't you cry. Oh, Susanna, don't you cry for me. I come from Alabama with a banjo on my knee. Okay. Now, that was kind of hard, wasn't it? It looks easy. It seems easy. And I want you to know that we trained people with late-stage dementia. They were in community living situations where they were supervised 24/7, which meant that they didn't have the skill to even live in their homes, that they had to have that kind of care. We're able to do what you just did. And nobody really believed that they could do what you just did. And I just wanted to start with that today so you know how difficult it is. And they were able to accomplish it. Now, they didn't do it the first time we walked in and put it together like I did today. That wouldn't have been possible. But the interesting thing about it was that when we would do music that controlled some training for attention, they would pop up with things to say. They would be able to follow through with certain tasks. And we knew for the many years that I worked at the VA hospital in Topeka, it was 20 years there, where the nurses would say, we always schedule our procedures around the times when you are going to finish your music therapy sessions. Because it's at that point where people seem to be a little more organized, they can tend to be a little bit more predictable in their behaviors, and they don't fight us. We found that through using attention-controlled training and going to the optimal attention was going to facilitate even conversations and memory. For instance, there was one woman who I had asked if she ever had played an instrument when we first started getting together, and she said, no, I don't know anything about that. And about 5-6 weeks later, she popped up one day after we'd been doing some of these rhythm kinds of things, and she said, did you know I used to play the saxophone in the Ellenwood High School marching band? A whole sentence, not fragmented, and completely targeted on the kind of thing that we were doing together. So she got it, and it finally rose to the surface. Well, the scientific research on this is really just starting, but we do know that the brain processes music all across the brain. And so as a result of that, what we think happens with dementia is that certain areas are stimulated and then they kind of come together. And so there's a certain part of settling down, getting the optimal attention. Hopefully people reduce the stress because they're comfortable in the predictability of the repeated rhythms. And then what happens is things come to the surface. And people can do things that you might not expect. So there's one aspect of leadership. And I think that probably we understand that when we are in our professions, leadership isn't always about just standing up in front of a group of people and saying, here's the flag, follow me. I've never been that kind of a leader. So I thought we probably ought to talk about some definitions of leadership. Conduct on the way or go before to show the way. Well, I never really felt like I could show the way. My leadership was really more about influencing and inducing and being part of the team, being a partner in the team, to influence, inspire, to help people not be discouraged. Because when you work with dementia care and you're doing things that nobody had ever heard of before and nobody knew what to do with these people, when we started in 1988 to do our clinical work at the VA, we found that we were leading the country in the kind of interventions that could happen in music therapy. And then I spent quite a few months, years, on the road going to Alzheimer's associations around the country and training just activity directors. They do a huge amount of work, but also nursing assistants and family members, because music was a way to interact with their family. And it was a way where they could actually connect for the first time. And I used ballroom dancing, and you would see the behaviors come back, and the dancing and the hugging and the kissing on the cheek. And the wives at the VA would say to me, I haven't seen my husband do this in years. Thank you for bringing him back to me. So, I have a whole nother series that's not in leadership. Jenny knows about my videos with people with dementia, but we're here to talk about leadership today. And so how does this happen? Well, I started in a place where I didn't really think of myself as a leader. I was born on a farm in central Kansas. This is going to sound like one of your great-grandmother's stories. I went to a 2-room school. No kidding, I did. There were first 4 grades in one room and the last 4 in the other. I spent most of the first 4 grades either in the coat closet locked in there by the nun who thought I was misbehaving, and I was, but I was just trying to be a leader. I was either in the coat closet or in the hallway. Now, my mother sent me to school when I was 5. I was to be eventually the oldest of 4, but I just had a little sister at that time, and a little brother was on the way, and I think, frankly, my mother just couldn't stand me. I've talked with her about this a little bit, and she said, oh, no, you were a model child. I know I wasn't. But at the age of 5, I was fairly precocious. I was playing the piano from the age of 2, playing melodies and singing, and so she thought I had the maturity to send me. And there weren't kindergartens at the time. I can remember sitting in that little bitty desk in the hallway, thinking to myself, this school is a terrible idea. I'm just going to walk home. Now, home, I knew, was at least 2.5 miles away. But I figured I could cut through the pasture and I could get home in probably, half a day. It was going to take me a long time because I had little legs. But I remembered the Union Pacific Railroad tracks, and I had to cross the railroad tracks to get there. And the trains came fairly frequently at that time. There aren't any now. But in my discussion in my mind, I decided that my dad would kill me. And it was probably smarter to stay in that little desk, even though I'd been crying off and on for quite a while. I mean, nobody does this to kids anymore, but it used to happen. And I decided I better stay. Okay, so here's part of leadership. Budding. Thinking through the alternatives, trying to determine what the consequences of the alternatives will be, and then deciding that certain alternatives are probably not a good idea. Well, that might be stretching it a little bit, but the point I'm trying to make is we have experiences through our lives that bring us to the point of nurturing us and forming us into the leaders that we're going to be. And I was always one of those kids that had all kinds of ideas. I was just talking with Jenny before I started this morning about how I had 2 girlfriends I was going to bring today, and I was going to drop them off at IKEA. I had this whole thing planned. They were going to have a great time. I would swoop by and get them, and then we'd go over to Oakport Mall, and we'd have this lovely day. because I plan those things and get everything going. But they decided last night it was just too cold to get out. So they're losing. I'm going to the mall without them. Okay. So leadership needs to be mission-focused. There needs to be a way that there's a direction in which we're going. It needs to be guided by wisdom. And I really never thought of myself as somebody who was terribly wise, at least not on my own. I really like to have other people's ideas, and I really thought that was a great way to put things together in leadership. It can't be ruled by fear or intimidation. And I think a lot of times we don't think of ourselves as leaders because we just say, oh my gosh, I could never do that. But you've served on committees at church, in your community, in your hospital, in your medical center, in your programs. You've had opportunities to lead, and very often you've done it, and you've done it well. So start to plant the seed that maybe you can do more. I really think that leadership involves doing the right thing, and sometimes it's very hard. And it has to be, I think, a willingness to embrace risk. It entails admitting mistakes and recognizing talent wherever that is. When I was president of our national association, it was some time ago, we had moved our offices from Lawrence, Kansas, to Washington, D.C. And we did it with a management firm's help. We were in between management firms when I took over, and we were so destitute from the management firm's fees and all of the things that were not transparent and the various things that happened to us that I truly thought we were going to not exist. We decided that we would work with a second management firm and see if we could reduce some of the services that they were providing for us at the time. Because we wanted the things like we had them in Lawrence, with a real hands-on, everybody gets the warm fuzzies. And they weren't about warm fuzzies, they were about making money. So I went into the office with a copy of the contract for the coming year. Being astutely aware, having worked in psych with children for 5 years in St. Louis, I was really aware of clothing and color and what it had as an influence over people's behaviors. So I wore a pink suit, sort of a raspberry bright pink suit, not quite as bright as this sweater, a little more subtle, but I love that. I wear that all the time now. And I had a silk tank top underneath, gray. Came up tall, no cleavage, it was straight out as an arrow. Okay, so the gentleman who meets me at the door is a Southern gentleman. He's y'all, how y'all doing? And he brings me in, and I have with me an assistant who I hope is going to kind of take over running things in Washington so I can come back home, and I can leave him to kind of get things organized. So he sets us on the couch, a low couch, so he can tower over us as he props himself against his huge walnut desk. So he yada-yadas about the baseball games and the football games. Now, I'm not a sports person, but I learned a long time ago, if you're going to do leadership, you got to read the newspaper sports section. Because they're going to ask you questions, and you're going to be able to have these conversations. It's a little bit above talking about the weather, but not a lot. It's just kind of the way that you're doing the warm-up. So he's against the desk in his suit and his tie, and I'm sitting on the low couch, and he says to me, well, he says, you know, we've been really struggling with doing all the things that you want us to do, and frankly, it's just too expensive. And I said, you know, that's interesting you should bring that up, because we really want those services. And so I would like to see if we can move service number 1 on this contract out. And I said, and I'd like for you to attach a price to that. And he says, oh, that's huge. He says, $25,000. And I said, well, let's just move it out. Will you agree to move it out? He said, yeah, I won't have to deal with it. So we went through a line of 3 or 4 other things to the point that I had talked him out of $80,000 worth of services. So we're still talking, and he's still towering over me. And then he moves around behind and sits behind his big, intimidating desk. Now, you know when somebody does this, the message is they're really separating. So I knew that the meeting was about over. So anyway, I suspected that he didn't respect me, first of all, because I was female, and second of all, I came from Kansas. How could anybody from Kansas have one speck of sense? They just are stupid there. That's all. So if you run into people like this, use it on them, all right? So I stood up and I said, well, it seems like we've accomplished what we needed to do today, and I need to get back to the board meeting, which is down the hall in the conference room. So I shook his hand and I said, we're in agreement? He said, we're in agreement. I walk out the door and I hear this yelling start because I left my friend assistant behind. And I'm very curious about this. He finally comes into the board meeting, and I said, well, Ed, how'd it go? He says, he said, after you left, he said, the man looked at me and said, how in the hell did I let that effing woman from Kansas in that pink suit talk me out of $80,000? Yay! Okay? So sometimes you don't know when you're going to have to do the leadership part. And it may just seem like a nasty job, because that certainly was. It was not a welcome thing, and it was terribly risky. And we knew at the point that we better get our addresses and membership downloaded immediately so we didn't lose it. Well, they took part of it, they dumped part of it, but we got most of it, and we were on from there. So we flourished since that time. So timing, when you're talking about leadership, is really important. And I used to say this when I was a professor and I was trying to mentor young faculty, because I learned this myself. When you're trying to publish something and you've sent it 2 places and you keep getting rejection, put it in a file. Of course, now you just keep it on your computer in a file. Don't give up on it. It's going to be useful one day. It'll be a beautiful piece of work at some point, but don't fight it. Find something that's popular, that is the big buzz right now. And I happen to be coming into aging at a time when it was big buzz to do research with Alzheimer's. I got my stuff in all the time. But I was smart enough to go that way. So I think it's really important to understand a lot happens by chance. Just understand what the trends are and what the chances are. Recognize the windows of opportunity. And when they open, go through them, because they may not ever come again. It's that business about, do you take this job? Do you take that job? Do you do this responsibility? Do you not? I was president when I was not yet 40. I think I was 36 when I was president of our national association. I was really young to lead a national association, particularly one that was in so much trouble. Now I'm proud to say I'm back on the board as the treasurer. I'm watching the money, and it's good. Things are happening. Okay, avoid resistance. It drains time and energy. Okay, music therapy practice, figuring it out. Now, I came into the field kind of serendipitous because, I grew up on that wheat farm. It was just a little wheat farm. It was near a town that had 500 people in it, right in the center of Kansas. I had an English teacher who was so busy crying over being dumped by her fiance that she couldn't teach English classes. And I really didn't have any in that Catholic school. I knew the catechism stuff. And I could sing Latin like nobody's business. I could sing the whole Mass of the Dead by myself, which I did when I came home from school. But, that wasn't very practical. And so I went to KU with the idea that I was going to be a nurse, because I think nurses are super. And I really always wanted to be one. So I'm driving down to KU to enroll in nursing, pre-nursing. And my mother says to me, you really need to probably think about this a little bit, because your math skills aren't that great. And you're getting Well, you got to be in biology. I think you probably didn't really apply yourself, but you really have to think about what you're good at, and I don't think it's going to be science. So I thought, okay. And then in a little bit she says, there's a new degree program at KU. And she said, you're really good in music, and you really have done all this music for all these years. I really hate to see you just let all that go. I was ready to let it go. I'm telling you, 2 hours of the piano every night, anybody would be ready to let that go. But she said, I really would hate for you to let that go. And she said, if you go down to KU, there's this new degree that's in music therapy. And I really think it's a combination of nursing and music. The next day I went in and enrolled in it. How nuts is that? I met E. Thayer Gaston, who is considered to be the father of music therapy, and he was so glad to see me. Well, because he didn't have a whole lot of students. Now, this was 1964. And music therapy was just established in 1950. So I was going into the field when it was so new. Nobody had ever heard of it. Nobody knew what it was, including Dr. Gaston. Because he was a trumpet teacher in Garden City, had been a music educator, came to KU, was in the music ed department, got his EDD. It wasn't even a PhD, it was an EDD, and we all know that those are separate, but that's okay. He just didn't have any practice. But he decided he was going to be the father of music therapy, and he was. Well, one thing led to another. Went through 4 years of classes. Now, mind you, by this time, I have my littlest sister, so there are 4 of us, and my dad is trying to squeak out a living on that little bitty farm, and my mom is teaching school to make ends meet. So there's been a lot of sacrifice to send me to school. And on the last day of class, E. Thayer Gaston says, well, to the 12 of us who were there, if you think you're going to leave here and get a job, you're badly mistaken because there aren't any. Can you imagine saying that to students you've had for 4 years and collected their tuition? Oh my. Well, so I was headed to internship in California, and I made up my mind that that sacrifice that my family made and that I made to learn what I learned was not going to be wasted. And I was determined that I had to figure it out. So I did an internship for 6 months, and the next month after, I had a brand new job at the San Joaquin County Association for Retarded, is what they called them then, citizens. And I made the job by going through the yellow pages and finding places to cold call, and got a woman who was interested in talking to me, had me out to the facility, talked to me, and hired me on the spot. I was working. So, eat your words, Gaston. Okay. So there wasn't a lot that was known, and I had to figure this out pretty much on my own. So this is a little bit about how, you learn from trials, but careful reflection, errors taught, truth taught in school. What I really learned was that a lot of the stuff he said in class was not true. Now, you see the leadership starting to kind of seep through, because I wasn't just going to take everything that was told me, I was going to test it. And when I tested it, I found out it didn't work. He didn't know any better, and it's a little embarrassing to say. He's been dead a long time, so I can say these things. Hardly anybody who ever knew him is around anymore. So when I look at this realistically, those of us who were early in the field had to invent it, and then we had to reflect and grow it. Now, that really happened in medicine too, but a lot longer before, and there's a whole lot more risk, I think, with the things that went on with the development of our professions. So with teaching, develop the concepts, so on and so forth, you are really probably not interested in all that, but it's part of what shapes me and what shaped the students I taught. So I think that's probably one of the largest contributions to leadership that could ever happen, is teaching. And if you don't see yourself as a teacher, you really are. If you work with anybody as a mentor, if you work with anybody as a clinical trainer, if you're an internship director, if you're a supervisor, all of this works into this idea of leadership. I learned early on to identify and support talent. I remember sitting down with a young student who was a sophomore and saying to her, you really need to think about a doctoral degree because of the way you think and the real intelligence that I sense with you and with the kind of work you've been doing here. She was a sophomore. She now is a professor at Colorado State University, and she is every bit as marvelous as I ever thought she could be. So try to identify the talent. Sometimes it's harder, sometimes it comes later. But when it happens, really work with it. Alleviate intolerance and jealousy. I really think that there are a lot of leaders who just really want to be the boss. And if they get into that culture of being jealous, you know, all I got to do is just one better than you, and I'm better than you are, doesn't work at all. And students will get into that kind of thing. Well, I'm the best guitar player in the school, I used to get from the kids in St. Louis. Well, it's because you've been here longer. You've been in treatment here for a year. Nothing to be too proud of, kid. That's not what I said, but you know, if you're about anything, you'd be getting back to regular school. Alleviate tolerance and jealousy is that individual path approach, where students would get into competition with one another, and I would sit them down and I would say, look, until you understand that you're on a path that's yours only, and so, who you're competing with is also on his or her individual path. You really need to get copacetic about this and be mutually supportive of one another, because you will never interrupt the other path unless you get derailed by some of this jealousy and ick you're doing right now, because it's counterproductive. Motivate through excitement for new knowledge and skill. I found that, you know, this happened because I would be in the field with somebody doing clinical training, and it would be something we didn't really know about, like the COPD work we did, where we had patients who could barely turn over in bed. They were so short of breath. They were end stage. And the PT said to me at the VA one day, she said, you know, we're using music to cue walking with stroke patients. I really wish we could do something for the COPD patients. I said, talk to me about what you're talking about. She said, well, there are two things that happen. The textbook says that you get their lung capacity by having them exercise. But there's a compromise, they can't exercise, and there's always that problem that they could actually have a stroke or heart attack right there in the spot and die in your arms. And I said, oh, well, that's pretty dramatic. And she said, well, it's what can happen. It's the truth of what will happen. And she said, and most PTs don't do the exercise training because of that. I came back the next week with a program where we cued the walking to slow it down, because COPD patients will tend to walk faster and faster so they can get from point A to point B before they run out of air. So, slow them down. And we could use music to cue the rhythm and the cadence. And then once we walked to capacity, where the PT judged it was time to quit, we'd set them down, and they would go into a dyspnea. And you know about dyspnea. You know it's a very painful breath. It can be very scary. And so the whole point then was to use the music to cue the inhalation and the exhalation, for the exhalation to be twice as long as the inhalation, so we could kick out the carbon dioxide. So we got the cueing going with the breathing. And the music also calmed, so people didn't get into that terrible frantic thing that they get into when they can't get a breath. My dad died of this disease. It's something that I felt near and dear to from the beginning. Any of you who've experienced it with people you love, watch it with horror, because it is really, really difficult. So what we found is that these people who couldn't turn over in bed, over a period, I was going to say, of 18 to 20 weeks, were walking 80 meters. They never got off their oxygen, but we didn't think they would. But can you imagine somebody who couldn't turn over in bed building up the capacity to walk 80 meters and ride a stationary bicycle for 10 minutes? and they started going out with their families. One man who, the pulmonologist said, you're going to die in 6 weeks. He was pretty disturbed, and he was my age. He was a Vietnam era vet. And I sat down with him one day and I said, we have this program. I can't promise you you'll live longer than your doc says you will, but what I can promise you is if you'll work with us, you'll feel better. And I said, there's just this one problem with a side effect. And he says, well, I'm dead now. When do we start? We discharged him to home. A year later, we got to thinking. We hadn't seen anything in the death notice for VA patients that comes up on the computer, which I couldn't access, but the PT could. So she said, let me check on him. He was still living. He was still at home. She said, we've got to get an OT out there, see what's going on. The OT went out and said, whoop, hasn't been walking, come back into the hospital. 2 years later, this guy is still walking around. We retrained him that second time and sent him home again. And I left the VA before he did, so I don't really know what happened to him. But the whole point of this is figure out what you can try to do together. This idea of putting your paths alongside one another and figuring out the best ways to deal with a situation that needs the leadership to do something new. Okay, living with giants. This is hard. It was really hard for me as a young professor, and I just had to sit down and have a talk with myself and get over it. Because I truly knew that there were people who I had as students who were smarter than I was. Or at least they knew a lot more about a certain area than I did. And I finally just said, okay, I'm doing just fine. What I'm doing is just great. It's good. It's good for me. It's not good for anybody else perhaps, but I'm on my path. And here comes this person who is absolutely a giant. And two of them are sitting here today. Jenny's one and Donna's one. Raise your hands. No, you don't want to raise your hands. Okay. To understand that these are the people who will come into your office and say, I have a really important question. Do you have a moment for me? And then an hour later, they get up and run out the door because they've got a whole new encouragement about what needs to happen. And for me to understand, I don't have to have the answers. All I have to do is listen and support and encourage and validate. So, open to the ideas, even if they don't seem feasible, because that COPD wasn't feasible, but we did it. Comfortable with change. Oh my gosh, if we always do things the way we've always done them, we will never go anywhere. Now, change for the sake of change is not particularly wonderful, but you understand what I'm talking about. Perceived change is an opportunity. I worked with a colleague who change just drove her crazy. It still does. She's there and I'm not, but I get messages from her every now and then. Could we have coffee? And it's usually because something has changed. And she said to me, when you left, I lost my rudder. She didn't call it an anchor. I was thinking it was anchored. No, because I wasn't really her anchor. She said, I lost my rudder. I said, you know what? You've got a good one. You just need to use it. Don't let change scare you. See what you can do with it that's exciting and encouraging and life-giving. Because doing the same things over and over again are not life-giving so much. Accept different opinions. I really think that that's probably hard for all of us, but it's particularly hard for me because I tend to be pretty bullheaded. And when I was 7, my mother told me much later, she and I became very, very good friends in the latter part of her life, and I really treasure that we could get to that point. And she would tell me stuff that happened, and she said, when you were 7, your dad said to me, Alicia's going to have a very hard life. And she said, I turned to him and I said, Reese, what do you mean? And he said, nobody can tell her anything. So I call it my standing up in a hammock problem, because I like to stand up in a hammock, figuratively, not realistically. It's kind of like you don't quite have your balance, but you kind of do, and it's really fun, and it's really exciting, and oh well, if something happens we can't really predict at this point, we'll figure it out. Well, that's maybe kind of a crazy way to live. I should have done a little better with my first marriage. That's when I should have been a little bit more cautious. That was a big mistake. Okay. So if things get to be controversial, controversy leads to all kinds of fertile ground. That's really wonderful. So looking at a leader's action words, listen carefully. And I learned this as a music therapist. Listen with your heart. Oh, I'm sorry. That microphone was there and I just split the eardrums of everybody. Thank you. Sorry out there. Listen with the ear of your heart. I learned this also from my Benedictine nun friend who I still am buddies with. It's not the things you hear that are said. It's the things that you hear because you sense it. And you sense it when you're in the medical profession a lot. That ear of your heart. Practice kindness, but people will think you're weak. So you're going to have to put up with those people who think you're weak. But practicing kindness is really a way, I think, to make the world a better place. Believe in people. That's hard to do sometimes because they don't give you a lot to work with, perhaps. Okay? Expect the extraordinary. I learned this in working psych with kids. I would teach them a guitar. They'd be 9 years old. They could barely get their hands across the fingerboard. And they would want to play some wild rock and roll song. And it would have a bar chord in it. And they'd say, we want to play the song. And I said, okay, here's what we have to do. And they'd say, is this hard? I said, no, it's a piece of cake. It was terribly hard. And they did it. They were wonderful at it because they didn't believe it could be hard. But I believed in them, and I expected the extraordinary, and they came across. Assist in the acquisition of skills and tools to succeed, but you don't have to do it for people. I'm editing a book right now, and it's making me crazy. I have to keep saying to myself, I don't need to write this over completely, perhaps. Maybe I can just send it back, and they could figure it out. Encourage, empower, and get out of the way. Because if we're in the way and we have to be acknowledged by those giants that are growing, then we will hold them back. I've seen programs in music therapy where the professors have insisted that the students never go any further than they did. And the graduates of those programs are stale before they even get out of the program. But at KU, they are the giants. And in other places too. A leader risks, sometimes fails, reflects. You always have to reflect. Every clinical session I did, I would sit down for 5 minutes or so and reflect on what I just did and what I just saw. And decide what was good and what was not so good and change it the next time. Analyze and evaluate, learn, recover when you fall out of the hammock. But never give up, keep trying. So I really think that a leader respects talent, skill, and ability because if they don't have it and somebody else does, it's a thing to be cherished. Communicates clearly, directly, and considerately because sometimes you got to deliver some bad news. I used to have a colleague at KU that when I was director of the program, I would call a student into my office. I had this big long table in there, and I would set the student at the end of the table, and the faculty of music therapy would gather on either side of the table, and I would always be in the side, never on the front of the table, and I would say to the student, from your behaviors, it seems like you're not real happy here. Can you talk to me about that? That's how it would start because they had really fouled up. This is what we referred to as taking them behind the barn and shooting them. Okay, so you knew when you got called into my office and you knew that something was up. I mean, you got called in for good things too, but you always knew if it wasn't. And I always like to put these meetings at least 2 weeks out so they could worry about it before they got there. And they did. And they would approach me in the hall and say, "Oh, Dr. Clair, what are you going to talk with me about on Friday next week?" And I said, "Come to the meeting and you'll find out." I'm not divulging anything at this point. So it gave them a time to do some soul searching. And so by the time they got in behind the barn, they knew that there was going to be some situation that we were going to need to deal with. And so it would ultimately come to saying to the student, it is really time for you to decide, do you really want to do this or not? And with one doctoral student, this was really tough because I had her in by myself. I didn't have anybody else in there. And I said, I don't think you really want to do this. And she said, "But I've spent a year here in the doctoral program." And I said, "So?" She said, "But what will everybody think? What will my friends think? What will my parents think?" I said, "Tell them you tried it and it really sucks and you don't want to be here anymore." And that's what she did. But she shouldn't have been in the field. And I thought it was time to move her on her way. So colleagues would do this with me, except for that one case, and they would say to me after, "Can you explain to me how you can have somebody into your office, throw the book at them, tell them they're terrible at what they're trying to do and they need to find another career, and at the end they will hug you as they go out the door?" I said, it's really not hard to figure out. It's respect, it's clear communication, it is honoring them with telling them the truth in a kind way so that everybody is on the same page to be going where we need to be going. And if this isn't the career for them, they really need to save their money and divert their energies in another way. All right, so communication is important. Committing to the mission, the end goal. I mean, what is the mission? We all have one. You may not have read yours for a while. I read mine every now and then in the Music Therapy Association because I refer to it as treasure when they're talking about spending money. Does this fit with the mission? If it does, okay. If it doesn't, maybe we need to rethink it. I think driven by values as a leader and not by competition is going to be the best bet. And then I think, ultimately, a really good leader has to have a servant's heart. Because you don't get really paid for doing leadership. Not all the time. Not all of it. You might have a salary compensation for being an interim dean. But really to have a servant's heart, to help people get where they need to go, to facilitate what needs to happen, so that everyone wins. Okay, are we just about done? Okay, because we are just about done. This is another whole bunch of lists of characteristics, and when I did this presentation, I just sat and reflected. It took me a long time to put the PowerPoint together, and then it's like all times, you put too much stuff on it, but do people have access to this? Good. Okay, so we don't really need to say much about this. You can read it later. But the last one I want to point out, as a leader, you need to limit the noise in your thinking. And you need to not be counterproductive. And if you ever spend time saying, "I should have," instead of, if you do that too much, it's really going to not lead you to good places. Beating yourself up for having tried and to have done your best. I think you might say, knowing what I know now, I would have done this a different way, and next time I will. But really, at the time I did it, it was done with the very best information I had at the moment, with the talent around me that I had at the moment, with the resources I had at the moment, and it was right at that moment. Next time, we'll do better. Okay, get out when it's time to quit. That's why I retired. Actually, at my retirement gathering, I had a professor who I highly respected, and he had retired the year before, came to me and said, "What are you doing?" He said, "You're at the top of your game. You're still publishing. You're still getting high ratings with your teaching. Everything is going so well. Why are you quitting?" I said, "Because I've seen professors who hang around far too long. And everybody, when they see them in the hallway, thinks, when in the hell are they going to get out of here so we can hire somebody to do this job? They got this gigantic salary, and we're just hamstrung by them. I said, nobody's going to say that about me, and I've heard it said about other people. And nobody's going to say, get the hook and pull her off the stage. We've had enough. So I said, I'm just leaving while it's good. But that was right for me, and it's not right for everybody. I think that leader needs to follow dreams. But my dreams were pretty small. My dream was to just get an undergraduate degree and somehow find a job. That was my dream. And then it ended up that, I'm not sure quite how to tell you this, but I got back to KU. They told me if I wanted to stay, I had to get a PhD, so I did. So 4 years after I came back to KU as an instructor, I had E. Thayer Gaston's job as director of music therapy. All right? So he probably flips over in his grave all the time thinking about that. Strive to be the best that you can be. Know others will sometimes get the credit. When I was president, I started a lot of things that didn't really come to fruition until maybe 2 or 3 years later. That was my stuff. But it would have really been impolite for me to stand up and say, that's my stuff, because the new president was taking credit for it. But that's okay, that's the way it goes. And then I think you have to forgive. Again and again and again. But don't forget, because if you forget, you get right back in those same circumstances with the same icky situation with the same icky people. So don't forget, but forgive them. All right. So here's my ploy to the medical profession, who, in my experience, but you all look pretty good out there, I have to tell you. My experience is they take care of everybody but themselves, all right? And music therapists tend to kind of be that way too. So it's important to get the good nutrition. You've heard this, your mother told you this, she probably still does. Reasonable exercise. I know these people that when they turned 50 started running marathons and triathlons, and I thought, are they absolutely nuts? Their body can't handle that. Sure enough, they're in the hospital getting all kinds of surgery. Sufficient sleep. That's really hard. Most of us don't sleep enough. And the world is such a better place when you sleep. So try. I would say to the students, all right, how many of you out there are under 21, 23 years old? They'd all raise their hands. I said, how many of you sleep 10 to 12 hours a night? Nobody raised their hand. I said, do you know that your brain's still developing? You need to sleep. Well, I don't know that we have anybody that young in this room. Maybe we do. But even those of us who are older need to sleep 8 hours if you can. Adequate play. Don't fail to play. Life-giving relationships. I had this girlfriend in college and then later in my first marriage, and when it broke up, she said to me, well, I could have told you that guy was no good. I don't know why you spent 19 years with him. Anybody could tell that. That was the last thing I needed her to say. I needed her to wrap her arms around me and tell me how sorry she was and cry with me and give me that support. So I decided to prune her. That's the thing about your life-giving relationships. Assess and prune. If they're not really good, prune them, because they are life-sapping, not life-giving. And she called me 5 o'clock in the morning one day, and I was asleep, and I wasn't in my right mind, and my filters weren't on, and she said, why haven't I seen you? It's been months. And I said, I've been making a list of my friends, and you're not on it. It was the truth. Anyway, but think about you don't have to be friends with people just because you've always been friends with people. You can set some boundaries around that. Limit your commitments. Allow time to reflect, create, and just be. Okay, beware. Sometimes you get what you wish for, and it's not at all what you want. So thank you for your lovely attention today. And I guess we have questions.
Questions.
Okay. Nobody has questions. That could be very bad.
Well, thank you very much for a lovely lecture and presentation. So when you do this music-based activity, especially for those patients and the COPD and all these, is it that you find music that works for them, or you develop or create a new music that works for them? Because the pacing will be different for different people.
The pacing is totally rhythmic. And it's a technique called rhythmic auditory stimulation, where we actually will use the rhythm to control the cadence. There's been a lot of research in the neurosciences that show that rhythm will actually coordinate motor movement output. And so we put the output they don't even know we're doing it really, but I'm playing guitar and singing and usually backing up and watching them walk so I can see their feet. And I will pace them to a point that's not too fast and not too slow, so that they can actually travel further and build their endurance. So I can slow them down by using the rhythm. I usually use music on top of it, and I use the music usually of the popular during the young adult years, and so I was dealing with a lot of people my age, and I was doing rock and roll. I can sing rock and roll and play the guitar, but the guitar is what's putting the rhythm into the walking. The melody is superfluous, really.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hi, I'm Marla. I have a question. Why is live music more something than recorded music? Why is live music more impactful?
Because we can control it. For instance, recorded music for walking with a COPD patient, the recorded music is always going to be at the tempo at which it was recorded, and it could be absolutely wrong for what you're trying to do with it. So the live music also seems to be a little bit more personable and maybe more intimate. I did a lot of singing with Alzheimer's patients and helped their family members do that because it was a way to be close. It's a very intimate thing. If you think about it, if you were ever rocked and sung to as a child, we never lose that sense and tenderness about how that comes back to us. So when patients would get so regressed they'd be in their beds and not able to move on their own, I very often sat bedside and sang to them, or had their wives do it. But they'd always tell me they couldn't sing. But I'd tell them to sing anyway, that their voice was the most wonderful one that the person could hear.
Hi, I'm Stephanie Berry. I'm one of the trauma critical care surgeons, and my question may be a little bit off base for what most of your research is in, but I have some interest in music therapy as part of our multimodal method of managing pain.
Yes.
And I just was curious about your experience with that.
Well, I just did a chapter called Music Therapy in the Military, where I ran across a study that was done just last year in 2017, where music actually is a very effective pain management addition to the treatment. And it didn't say a lot about what that meant. They did a meta-analysis, and so, they pulled a lot of things through that. But there are music therapists who work with pain management. There's one music therapist here on staff, but I think she's in pediatrics. If you're interested in that, we can follow up. I can put you in touch with the people at KU. Oh, it's you? Pardon me. Okay. Very good. All right. Yes. So that you have somebody to start working on those ideas. That's marvelous. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.